Asserting central space immediately, this pawn surge aims to unlock diagonals for your bishop and queen. Instantly establishing an imbalanced battlefield, c5 seizes central territory and challenges white's pawn on e4, leading to dynamic, non-symmetrical play. Instantly seizing central space, this knight aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for further development. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, potentially challenging white's knight. Gaining a tempo with the bishop forces black into a decision, potentially disrupting their pawn structure or development. Developing the knight to d7 is a flexible option, reinforcing the center and preparing for pawn advances, though it slightly delays castling. Castling initiates a swift centralization of the monarch, immediately fortifying its safety and preparing for a central pawn advance. Challenging white's bishop outpost, this pawn thrust questions white's early aggression and seeks to disrupt white's harmonious piece development. Retreating the bishop allows for a more flexible pawn structure and prepares to contest the d4 square. Developing a knight to its most natural square, the knight prepares to contest the center and aid in kingside defense. Reinforcing the central pawn chain with c3 prepares to expand on the queenside and shores up the bishop's retreat square should it come under pressure. Solidifying central pawn structure and preparing for the inevitable pawn push to d5 becomes the priority, while also opening a diagonal for the queen to potentially develop and support the upcoming central expansion. Securing the queenside pawn chain from immediate counterplay, this advance prepares to expand white's influence on the queenside, potentially aiming for b4 to contest black's central pawn control and gain space. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now, black prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest white's spatial advantage and prepare for potential queenside expansion or counterplay. Retreating the bishop to c2 offers a safe haven while eyeing the d6 pawn and preparing to potentially pressure the queenside. Developing the bishop to b7 solidifies the diagonal, preparing to contest the open c-file once it eventually forms and potentially offers an alternative attacking avenue should white's kingside pressure stall, while also ensuring the king's safety behind a pawn shield. Preparing to support the central pawn push is the primary objective here, aiming to open lines for attack while also consolidating the kingside. Black immediately seizes the initiative, expanding on the queenside and forcing white's pieces to react, creating an imbalanced pawn structure that will define the middle game's strategic battles. The knight abandons the kingside's active participation, awkwardly relocating to the edge, which, while potentially preparing for a queenside expansion, grants black significant central space and initiative. Consider how this flank maneuver might leave white's central pawns vulnerable to a future pawn storm, or how black can now better exploit the open diagonals towards white's castled king. Developing the queen to c7 offers solid support for the knight on d7 and eyes the b6 pawn, a potential target if white's queen's knight advances further. Relocating the bishop to a more passive square, white essentially concedes valuable central influence and surrenders the initiative on the queenside, allowing black's pawns to advance unimpeded and construct a formidable blockade. Developing the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and reinforcing the queenside defense. A subtle repositioning, Ba2 prepares to contest the open file, potentially aiming for an exchange that could liberate the bishop from its current constricted square, while simultaneously creating an escape route for the king should the queenside become too crowded. Black liberates the bishop from its defensive posture, accepting an immediate pawn sacrifice that opens diagonals and potentially creates counterplay. This bold exchange aims to disrupt white's tidy pawn structure and might force a simplification or expose white's king slightly. The challenge now is to ensure the captured pawn doesn't become a dangerous passed pawn for white, and to develop the freed pieces to active squares before white can solidify. Capturing the pawn on c4 immediately frees up the diagonal for the bishop and resolves white's pawn structure problem on that side. But it also grants black 2 additional central pawns and strengthens their control over the d4 square, potentially leading to a cramped position for white's pieces if not handled carefully. The king finds a much-needed sanctuary on its original square, completing a critical safety maneuver that was paramount after the capture of the bishop. Retreating the bishop to f1, after a period of active piece play and central pawn tension, signals a shift towards solidifying white's position and preparing for a more deliberate maneuvering phase, potentially aiming to reroute the bishop to a more supportive diagonal or simply avoiding the immediate complexities on the queen side. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on a more active diagonal, BB7* aims to challenge white's queenside space advantage and pressure the c3 pawn, while also preparing for potential pawn breaks or the recapture of a central pawn should the opportunity arise. Challenging black's pawn chain control, d4 initiates a central struggle, aiming to pry open lines for white's pieces and disrupt black's harmonious development. Challenging the center head-on, black seeks to break free from white's subtle spatial squeeze, immediately contesting the d4 pawn and aiming to open lines for their pieces, particularly the bishop on b7 and the queen. This thrust introduces immediate central tension and forces white to make crucial decisions about pawn structure and piece activity, potentially leading to exchanges or a tactical skirmish if white miscalculates the subsequent complications. Navigating the cramped queenside with the knight suggests a plan to uncoil the kingside, perhaps aiming for a d5 pawn push later or redeploying the knight to a more active square like e3 or g3, where it can support attacks or strengthen the pawn chain. Rethinking the pawn structure and reinforcing the central control, black subtly repositions their rook, preparing for potential breakthroughs on the e-file while simultaneously creating a more harmonious piece alignment. A strategic repositioning unfolds as the knight embarks on a journey to the kingside, eyeing squares like f5 and g4 to potentially disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and lend support to a future kingside assault. This pawn push decisively claims central territory, aiming to disrupt white's pieces and potentially create an outpost for the knight on c2. Targeting the weak f7 square, white's knight aggressively repositions, threatening immediate disruption and hinting at a potential kingside assault, while black's pawn push has created a somewhat cramped pawn structure. Unleashing the knight to g5 creates immediate discomfort for black's kingside. Your decision to push the h-pawn is a direct response to this pressure, aiming to dislodge the attacking knight and gain vital breathing room. This pawn advance, however, opens up new avenues of attack for white on the g-file should the knight retreat, and subtly compromises the structural integrity of your pawn chain. Consider the long-term implications of weakening the dark squares around your king. While it addresses the immediate threat, it might be planting the seeds for future positional challenges. Shifting the knight to the kingside, aiming to redeploy it towards e5 or f4, intends to challenge black's encroaching pawn structure and free up the d4 pawn's advance. The d5 pawn boldly advances, aiming to solidify the center and potentially launch a kingside assault, while also creating a strong outpost for the knight on e4. Unleashing the knight to an aggressive outpost, this move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances, potentially forcing concessions in the king's vicinity. The bishop retreats to a quiet square, a passive stance considering the active pawn push white is preparing. Black's position feels a bit cramped, with pieces like the knight on d7 lacking immediate scope and the queen somewhat exposed by the central pawns. While preventing the knight from reaching g5 might seem logical, it doesn't address the underlying space advantage white is building and the potential pressure on the kingside. This maneuver, though defensive, might concede too much initiative and allow white to consolidate their growing influence without significant immediate threats. Unlocking the c-file with intended pressure, this bishop repositions to activate the queenside majority and prepare for a potential skirmish where white aims to exploit black's somewhat passive development. Black's queen repositions, seeking to escape the pin and potentially activate itself on the c-file, but it also grants white more central influence by allowing the d-pawn to advance unopposed. Sharpening the attack on the queen side, the rook slides to c1, eyeing the open file and aiming to bolster the end's attack after the d-pawn pushes. The pawn advances, seeking to break open the queen side and gain crucial space, challenging the bishop's diagonal and forcing a decision about the queenside structure. Opening the A-file, white initiates a strategic gambit to exploit black's potentially loose kingside pawn structure and force dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and create tactical opportunities. Black reclaims material and ignites a dynamic counterplay by recapturing on B5, strategically opening the file for potential future incursions and forcing white to reevaluate their piece placement. Unleashing the queen onto the queen side, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances along the third rank and the queen side open files. Unleashing the rook from its passive position, black injects a dynamic counterplay into the queen side, aiming to dislodge white's entrenched bishop and open lines for attack. Reclaiming the initiative, white repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge the queen's influence and potentially support a central advance or reroute to a more threatening diagonal. A potential regrouping effort, aiming to redeploy the knight from its slightly awkward position to a more active square, perhaps eyeing the queenside or preparing for a central challenge. Liberating the light-squared bishop from its prior confinement, this maneuver seeks to activate the piece and exert pressure along the long diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and perhaps create imbalances for future exploitation. Seeking to untangle the pieces and create a more harmonious setup, the knight repositions, aiming to support potential advances on the kingside, or simply find a more active square away from the current pawn chains and white's control of the d4-e5 diagonal. Reclaiming the initiative, the bishop retreats, preparing to redeploy to a more active diagonal and perhaps eyeing the kingside. A bold redistribution of forces, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic play on the queenside, even if it means sacrificing some immediate central control. Injecting immediate tension, this knight leap aims to exploit the slightly misplaced black queen and the exposed nature of the kingside, forcing a reassessment of black's defensive structure. Black disrupts white's knight outpost and forces a positional concession, aiming to open lines against the king and exploit the less developed kingside by simplifying the game. The exchange on e3 opens a crucial diagonal for white's queen and reinforces the center with the doubled pawns, while simultaneously weakening black's pawn structure and potentially exposing the king. Repositioning the knight to b6 cleverly prepares for a potential pawn push on c5, aiming to disrupt white's center and create dynamic counterplay. Refocusing the rook's influence back to the kingside after the pawn skirmish, preparing to challenge the open e-file and potentially reinforce the e4 square, which now looks a touch exposed. Sensing an opportunity to disrupt white's entrenched pieces, black redirects the knight from its relatively passive posting to a more active square, immediately challenging white's central control and potentially opening lines for further initiative. Shifting the bishop to e2 shores up the king's defense and clears the diagonal for a potential queenside maneuver, preparing for future central expansion or piece redeployment. A decisive shift begins as black ignites the queenside, aiming to activate dormant pieces and disrupt white's pawn chain. Initiating exchanges on the queenside seeks to dismantle black's attacking setup, a proactive measure to curb the growing pressure orchestrated by the pieces on the file. The captured pawn strategically opens the b-file, granting your rook's immediate access to the open file and potentially pressuring white's queenside. This spatial concession by white, forced by the exchange, creates new avenues for your pieces and demands immediate attention from your opponent to defend their compromised structure. The queen vacates the d-file, preparing to potentially redeploy to a more active square, perhaps to support a central pawn push or to join an attack on the queenside, while also opening a path for the c1 rook to potentially join the fray along the c-file, adding more pressure to black's somewhat cramped position. A strategic regrouping begins, rerouting the knight to a more active outpost and preparing to contest the open b-file, forcing white to defend against potential incursions. Reasserting control over the c-file is paramount. This rook's maneuver aims to disrupt black's centralized queenside pressure and potentially prepare for a future pawn push or piece redistribution. Introducing dynamism to the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's entrenched structure by leveraging the open B file and potentially creating attacking chances against the king's defenses. Observe how it forces reconsideration of white's piece placement. White aims to consolidate the queenside and prepare for a potential kingside assault by repositioning the queen to a more active and safer square. A crucial regrouping maneuver, *BC8* aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting an eventual RB2 push and offering better defense for the king by clearing the way for the rook on A8 to potentially swing over. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure, a belated attempt to create space and potentially launch an attack. Unleashing the bishop's long-range potential across the dark squares offers a promising attempt to disrupt white's seemingly anchored knight and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside, though it does expose the bishop to potential skirmishes if white can organize a counter. Unlocking the c-file suddenly becomes a pressing concern as white reroutes the queen, seeking active engagement and potentially setting up a future assault on black's queenside pawns. The bishop vacates the e7 square, allowing the queen to potentially reposition to b7, a more active diagonal, while also freeing up the e8 square for the rook. Recentralizing the rook to the d-file initiates a subtle yet potentially powerful shift, aiming to establish influence over the open d-file and perhaps prepare for a future advance of the d-pawn, creating a passed pawn. Pushing the g-pawn opens up avenues, a bold bid to disrupt white's entrenched position and potentially create weaknesses around their king, though it also sacrifices some pawn cover and demands careful calculation regarding counterplay. Opening the h-file creates immediate attacking possibilities, forcing black to react defensively and potentially weakening his king's shield. Opening the h-file like this immediately creates dynamic tension, presenting white's king with a potential fissure that could be exploited later if the surrounding pieces aren't carefully managed. Reclaiming the knight's central influence is paramount, as the king's pawn shield begins to fracture under the relentless pressure of black's bishop. Introducing a bold offensive concept, black shoves a rook deep into white's territory, aiming to disrupt the queenside and create immediate imbalances. Initiating a critical pawn break in the center to disrupt black's cramped position and potentially open lines toward the king is the aim here. Sacrificing the rook on b2 ignites a tactical storm, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and open lines towards the king. Sacrificing the rook on b2 unveils a fascinating tactical knot, forcing black into a calculation challenge to determine if the material gain is truly worth the defensive concessions. The rook's triumphant journey to the second rank, facilitated by the previous queen sacrifice, dramatically alters the tactical landscape, transforming a positional struggle into a sharp, immediate confrontation. Unleashing a bishop's latent power, this maneuver aims to seize control of the crucial light squares, particularly the diagonal leading towards black's vulnerable king. White seeks to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create attacking opportunities by repositioning this piece to a more active post, preparing for further coordinated action. Unshackling the bishop from its passive pinning, this retreat aims to reposition it for a more active role, potentially eyeing the king side or supporting advances on the queen side, a welcome re-engagement after being sidelined. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain with this advance immediately challenges black's central pawn structure, creating both attacking opportunities and potential weaknesses that must be carefully managed. Embracing the chaos, black aims to disrupt white's centralized pawn mass and potentially create new avenues of attack. The queen's repositioning threatens to exploit any loose threads in white's defenses, particularly around the weak f2 square and the slightly exposed king. Initiating pawn storm action on the kingside aims to pry open lines towards black's monarch, exploiting the exposed nature of the king now that the defender has been dislodged from its protective square. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing to counterattack along the now open f-file is the primary goal here, creating a defensive barrier and hinting at future counterplay. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to pry open the kingside, aiming to expose black's monarch through the newly created diagonal for the bishop. Sacrificing the queen to dismantle the pawn shield around the white king offers a desperate, but perhaps necessary attempt to generate counterplay against an overwhelmingly dominant position. The queen trade is now inevitable, and clearing this crucial diagonal for the bishop after its earlier repositioning is a logical, if somewhat passive, follow-up. A bold declaration to reignite the kingside battleground, transforming the once solid pawn wall into a battlefield of opportunity, forcing white to confront immediate material imbalances and potential defensive weaknesses. The king's journey to safety begins now, stepping away from the pawn storm brewing on the kingside and seeking refuge on a more stable square. Acknowledging the pawn structure's current immobility, black's bishop now seeks a more active role, eyeing the long diagonal. Reasserting control over the open files by placing the rook on the b-file aims to pressure black's isolated queen's rook pawn and potentially create new attacking avenues. An ambitious attempt to anchor the bishop on a more active diagonal, seeking to disrupt white's piece coordination. Unleashing a powerful rook check, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially force concessions. The critical point here is how black responds to the exposed king and whether the rooks can coordinate effectively to create threats or exploit weaknesses. This move injects immediate tactical urgency, forcing a concrete reaction that will define the ensuing exchanges. The king ventures from its protective pawn shield, seeking refuge amidst a chaotic battlefield where open lines present myriad threats. Seizing the open file with the rook dramatically alters the board's dynamic, challenging black's defensive structure and forcing immediate consideration of the king's safety. Seeking to solidify the king's safety and prepare for potential defensive maneuvers, black maneuvers the monarch to the central file, aiming to shelter it behind the remaining pawns and potentially facilitate a coordinated counterthrust along the d-file or even a kingside pawn push later on. King safety becomes paramount as the rooks dance on the 8th rank, forcing the black monarch to dance along. A quiet moment of regrouping, repositioning the monarch to a more defensible square away from the immediate danger zone of the open files, while simultaneously preparing for potential exchanges that could arise from white's initiative on the queen side. The rook's advance to the 7th rank seizes a crucial outpost, threatening to expose the black king's defenses and potentially sever the connection between the remaining pieces. The repetition of moves brings us back to a familiar square, offering a chance to reassess the unfolding endgame. This position is characterized by white's slightly better piece activity and black's pawn structure. The current sequence suggests a strategic stalemate, but black must remain vigilant about allowing white any initiative, particularly with that rook on the 7th rank. Consider how to break this cycle constructively, perhaps by preparing a pawn advance to gain space or by repositioning the king to a more secure outpost. The rook dances back, an elephant repositioning to control vital squares on the 5th rank. Confronting the perpetual check, black gambits the passed pawn's potential for a moment's respite. Bringing the knight back to g3 aims to reinforce the king's defenses and potentially reroute the piece to a more active square, perhaps supporting a kingside pawn advance or even hopping over to f5 if the opportunity arises later, while simultaneously disengaging from the pin that was created by the black bishop on c8. The pawn structure is completely shattered on the queen side, creating a chaotic dance for the pieces. Black's intention is likely to consolidate and reorganize, perhaps aiming to use the open files to activate the remaining rooks or establish better defensive positions. However, with white's pieces poised for potential infiltration, any misstep could be costly. Retreating the rook allows white to consolidate and prepare for the endgame, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king. Unyieldingly consolidating the bishop's influence, this retreat repositions the piece to a more robust defensive square, preparing to counter any immediate threats from white's rook and knight on the queen side.